Dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm very pleased that we can welcome Paulina to the lecture this evening. Welcome to all of you, welcome especially to Paulina. First of all, I would now like to briefly introduce Paulina. She is an associate professor of Russian literature and now she teaches in Amherst. But in summer, she will be teaching Russian literature at the University of California at Berkeley, where now Luba is. Paulina received her BA from St. Petersburg State University, but her MA and the PhD from the University of California. She has defended her dissertation in 2006, and the title was Enchanted by the Spectacle of Death, Forms of the End in Leningrad Culture, 1907 until 1934, and this topic is central for Paulina's poetry and her research. Her scholarly publications include also articles on Nabokov, Bakhtin, on early Soviet film, on historical trauma in literature and film, and especially a book entitled Besieged Leningrad, Aesthetic Responses to Urban Disaster. It was published in 2017. In Besieged Leningrad, Paulina examines how the city's inhabitants adjusted to their awful new urban reality, focusing on the emergence of new spatial perceptions that fostered the productions of diverse textual and visual representations. In this first study of the cultural and literary representations of spatiality in besieged Leningrad, Paulina examines a wide range of authors with competing views of their difficult relationship with the city, and she's filling a gap in Western knowledge of the culture of the siege. But Paulina is also a great poet. She began writing poetry already at the age of 8, and since then, during many years, had been attending a legendary Kruzhok, a studio for writing children led by the poet Vyacheslav Leikin. She released her first book of poetry as a teenager. The book was named Christmas in 1991. Today, Paulina is author of 12 collections of poems, I hope I'm right, and 2 books of prose in Russian. A collection of creative nonfiction living pictures, Живые картины, received the Andrei Bely Prize in 2015. The book is translated in German by Olga Radetskaya and published last year in the Surkamp Verlag, and is also published in English, in an English translation. Furthermore, Paulina edited the Leningrad Siege Poetry Anthology, written in the dark with Ugly Duckling Press. I hope you can see this, and has 4 collections of poetry published in English translations. These are this Lamentable City, the Zoo in Winter, and she is also present in this book. You cannot see the title, but I can tell you how it is named. This is Relocations, 3 contemporary Russian women poets. This is Paulina, and furthermore Anna Glazova and Maria Stepanova. And the editor of this project is Catherine Tierpiela, and she is in the audience today. And she has also translated for this edition. So Paulina's poetry has been translated also in French, Dutch, Danish, Italian, and perhaps other languages. Marian Hacker, a well-known American poet, translator, critic, and professor of English emerita at the City College of New York, characterized Paulina's poetry with these words: "These poems arise from a confluence of history and lyric, fraught with danger, but vibrant with inquiry." Paulina won several literary prizes, as for instance, the Babylon All-Russian Competition for Young Writers in 1992, or the Russian Internet Competition Tinyota 1998, and the Young Poet Prize Moskva Transit 2005. And as I already mentioned, the Andrew Belli Prize in 2015. But now I turn the floor over to Polina. She will now give a speech on the topic Calliope and Clio as co-authors, history as method, material and challenge in contemporary Russian poetry, or briefly named uses of history and contemporary Russophone poetry. So please, Polina.
Thank you. Спасибо. A couple of remarks. Thank you, my dear friends, dear audience, for being here today. It's absolutely wonderful to see some of you and kind of horrifying to see some of you. It's a high order to talk in your presence. I'll try my best. Henrique, I want to thank especially you for your work and your center for what appears to me to be a rather revolutionary direction in the studies of Russophone and larger Slavic poetics today. Not that many people or institutions pay regular attention to what is happening in contemporary Russian poetry. And I think some important things are happening. For example, I'm really glad that today I have this opportunity to talk about history writing and rewriting in Russian poetry today. I think it's a crucial dimension. And it was a real effort, a challenge to focus on these authors for various reasons. Because actually, when I began thinking whom I want to talk about, whom I want to think about, I would say dozens of names and texts came to my mind. I argue that this is one of the nerves of contemporary Russian poetry making. This is one of its active zones. History today is often written in terms of poetry in Russian culture. And I think it's a very interesting and difficult question, why? And maybe this is today one of the opportunities to think and to discuss together with you why, and if indeed it's the case. So it's not an easy genre to deliver a paper via Zoom. Sometimes I will improvise. Of course, you'll understand that improvisation is endlessly rehearsed and things like this. After a year of teaching via Zoom, as all of us, most of us, I've thought about every register that allows one not to make your listeners to fall asleep immediately. Let's try our best. Uses of history in contemporary Russophone poetry. In his study on uses, abuses, and creative transformations of history and memory in modernity, French historian Jacques Le Goff reminds us that, I quote, history is a narrative, which can be true or false based on, quote unquote, historical reality or pure imagination. It can be historical narrative or a fable, depending on the needs of the one who peruses history. This garden variety of possibilities and the very understanding of history as usable, malleable material comes handy when one faces various strategies of history representation in contemporary Russophone poetry. In general, I would like to offer my opinion that now is an extremely fruitful time to study this topic. Poets address historical events, problems, and processes often, and this particular choice of examples in my today presentation is largely idiosyncratic. There are some other important and challenging texts and projects. Maybe I can mention them in Q&A. So let's start. A week ago, on April 19th of this year, Boris Khersonsky, a Russophone poetry and psychiatrist living in Odessa, put onto his Facebook feed a poem depicting his grandfather's return to Odessa in 1946 after his participation in the Second World War. Now I will read this poem in Russian. You will see also this text in its English translation, just in case. All the translations that I will offer are tentative in terms of these are not publishable poetry translations. These are attempts, with the exception of the last one. I'll talk about it later. Дед вернулся в Одессу из армии в 46-м. Ветер гулял в разграбленном доме пустом. Новый владелец деда не ждал. Он вытащил пистолет и даже выстрелил в потолок. Сведений нет о его биографии и его дальнейшей судьбе. Он тоже вернулся с фронта в наш дом, словно в дом к себе. Видно, думал, что все погибли. Но вернулись и дед, и отец. Папа на костылях, тут и сказки конец. Да, кое-какую мебель соседи вернули с трудом. Вскоре бабушка возвратилась в наш довоенный дом. 2 комнаты в страшной коммуне на 2-м этаже. Рядом с теми, кто думал, надеялся, что никто не вернется уже. This poem narrates a peculiar historical situation, seemingly very pedestrian, бытовая one, a conflict between neighbors, yet actually revealing much deeper social sutures, wounds, and scars. One of many between those who left Odessa for the front and those who remained in the city. The subtext being that Odessa was a city with a rather striking, peculiar history of the so-called, and here I absolutely use quotation marks, collaboration of the Soviet civil population with the Nazi forces and their allies. Odessa was occupied by the Romanian forces that, after immediately taking care of the Jewish question, then created, which we are still studying as an example of the paradoxical social and economical renaissance from 1941 to 1943. Also in this poem, we see a conflict between those who returned from the front earlier and later, perhaps delayed in the concentration camps of various parties. As with the overall history of occupation and, again, quote unquote, collaboration, this episode remained and still remains in the blind zone of the contemporary Russian official historiography. And the very fact that Khersonsky situates it in the center of his and our attention is significant, but equally significant is the situation of its publication and what kind of responses readers give to this text, Facebook readers. So the very fact that it was published on the Facebook feed is crucial. And this is a footnote, but for this part of the conversation, I would like to stress also as a direction of possible thinking and research and exploration that it is Facebook, I think, that today occupies very special place in how Russian poetry, Russophone poetry is published. And for me, I have no doubts that this forum of publication, this form of publication really influences how Russophone poetry is happening today. So this text is published in one flow with Khersonsky's daily personal news, pictures of his wife, also a poet, and his cat, also together with his political utterances. Khersonsky has strong opinions, mostly anti-New Russia, anti-Putin's regime. Thus, the poem becomes a particle, a segment of the poet's publicized personal and family history. After all, it's a text about history as experienced by his family. Here, in another footnote, it should be mentioned that Khersonsky is perhaps most widely known and written about collection is Family Album, Семейный альбом, which presents history of the Soviet century through experiences of the members of his family, as told to the poet, and through the poet, I can add. I argue that Khersonsky's special technique here is that of personalization. If you wish, appropriation of history by means of post-memory. In this poem, he retells story allegedly told to him by his grandmother. And this leads to particular kind of responses in his Facebook feed. We see that this text triggers in his readers their family memories, other fragments of other family archives. And these responses are seemingly much more direct than those that could be elicited by the regular historical scholarly article, or perhaps by a poem in a regular collection. Readers of the Facebook entry poem write, I quote, "The same happened to my grandfather!" Exclamation mark. In case of my grandmother, it was completely different. And then they offer their own versions of what happened in Odessa after war. Now I have to present a method that I exercised working on these remarks, on these observations. And this is one of, I guess, not so many pluses of writing about living poets. They are difficult, they're cranky, they contradict themselves, but also they offer their opinions. So I asked all the poets about whom I'm talking here, what do you think are the possibilities of historical poetry in comparison to more traditional scholarly mode of inquiry? Khersonsky, who seems to be present on Facebook 24/7, answered immediately. His answer was краткость, эмоциональность, прямота, succinctness, emotionality, and directness. Indeed, in an inventively direct way, Khersonsky reincludes the officially prohibited, suppressed episode of history into public discourse by presenting it as his treasured family possession. He changes the status of historical event, showing it not as a bleak, blind spot of macrohistory, but instead as an object from a family album, as something that happened to his family members, something immediate, relatable, and in many ways open-ended. Succinctly indeed, in a very dense way, he manages to pack the text with various ironies, giving the status of the fairy tale, вот из сказки конец, to a horrific situation of coexistence in one communal space of people who hope to build their well-being on disappearance, using Bulgakovian diction, of their neighbors. This traumatic coexistence also has an allegorical value. It is not difficult to translate this whole situation on the post-war Soviet situation as a whole. Yet somehow, Khersonsky prefers concrete and familiar to grandiose and abstract. In other words, he makes history personal, gives it specific faces, voices, and mise-en-scène, thus strongly manipulating his readers into direct participatory reaction. This approach of personalization of history with different nuances is not unique for Khersonsky's work. Let's look at another example. My second case, Ilya Kukulin. So I'll read the text again in Russian, and then we'll see what is to be done with it. Можете смеяться, но Николая Ивановича Бухарина особенно жалко. Он был по-человечески очень симпатичным, что называется просто хороший мужик. Но по объективным показателям настоящий вурдалак, как и все они. В Стокгольме в 1916-м он жил по поддельным документам на имя Мойши Долголевского. Его вдова Анна Ларина, совершившая подвиг любви, а в перестройку воспетая как хранительница связи с ленинскими традициями, вспоминала: в Стокгольме он стучался к ее отцу Юрию Ларину, он же Ихим Михоэл Лурье. Всю жизнь ходил с трудом, совершил побег из ссылки, вынесенный товарищами в корзине для белья. С радостным криком: «Откройте, мой Шааба Пинхус Долголевский пришел!» Мысль об остановке времени вызывает у меня ужас, но лично для Бухарина я бы остановил его во всем мире в этот момент, в 1916 году. Все живы. Еще нет ни революции, ни слов Бухарина и Пятакова о том, что расстрелы и трудовая повинность способствуют формовке нового человечества. Ни отчаянных писем Сталину из тюрьмы, в которых Бухарин сравнивает себя с Исааком, а Сталина с Авраамом, и в ужасе пишет, что не видит ангела за кустом, что готов сказать на суде все, что прикажет ради торжества революции, только дайте увидеть жену и сына. Я скажу им, что ни в чем не виноват. Время останавливается в лучшей точке его жизни, Лошадь, запряженная в конку, застыла с поднятой передней ногой, здоровающиеся друг с другом шведы с цилиндрами на отлете. В реющем над водой Стокгольме, городе на 17 островах, молодой веселый мужик колотит в дверь своего будущего тестя и орет на всю Ивановскую: «Откройте!» Мойше Аба Пинхус Долголевский пришел. What is Kukulin's work in this text? This is my reader's response. I find almost unbearably touching. Kukulin obviously not only operates on history as historical reality, returning to my original quote, but on the very notion of the flow of historical time. His position shifts from that of the historian who can assess the events with the retrospective knowledge to that of the poet who, using his historical imagination, searches for punctum in time, borrowing the famous term of Roland Barthes. That one point of view via which the poet can gain access not to the political and historical figure Nikolai Bukharin, but to a human construction, Moishe Dolgolevsky, Bukharin's alternative persona of traveler and lover, also lover of Stockholm. Kukulin shows us the world of this human and the world around him at the ultimate close-up, that we could fully appreciate every possibility with which this moment was pregnant, including possibility of individual freedom and happiness, not only possibility of revolution and subsequent terror. To my inquiry, what historical poetry allows you? Kukulin answers, it allows me to feel through and to talk through my personal connection to the fact. Sometimes directly using the notion of the self, sometimes not. It allows me to formulate the dramatic dimension of the event in light of what preceded it and what came after. And also it allows me to recreate the context. In this case, the world of Stockholm at the turn of the centuries. You cannot put this in an article, exclamation mark. Yet for me, this place is one of the most inspiring in the world. I wanted to test my character with the experience of happiness. End of quote. I suggest, in addition to inclusion of the writer's opinion and relation, it allows him to imagine the other alternative opportunities to represent history not only as what was, but also what could have been, thus achieving the ever desirable and elusive effect of estrangement. Inclusion of strangeness techniques into historical narration is an important practice today. For example, we see it done a lot by a poet, Yelena Mikhailik, who lives in Australia. Like Khersonsky, she is Odessa born. Like Kukulin, She is a brilliant historian of literature. So this is a poem by Михайлик. Белоглазое змеи-чудовище наблюдается у мыса Чауда. Рота красноармейцев пешим порядком направлена навстречу ему. Какие зоологи, экспедиции, прочая музейная ерунда. Известно, что делать с белым гадом в 21 году в Крыму. Он может рассчитывать только на то, что причерноморские города много старше любых властей, немногим моложе костей земли. На то, что чудовищ вовек хранит негостеприимная, неживая вода. И красноармейцы нырнут туда, забыв, откуда пришли. Теперь они бродят по мелководью, собирают яшму и сердолик. Чудятся случайным прохожим, пьют у Волошина чай с вареньем. Их мир погас, как солнце в стекле. Больше некого брать на штык. И только змей утешает их, берега оглашая шипением. Curiously and importantly, Михайлик starts her poem at the place where her research, quote unquote, fails her. In her scholarly work, she studies possible connection between a poet Max Voloshin and writer Mikhail Bulgakov. It was suggested before in scholarly literature that the newspaper clipping about the sighting of a monster at Chauda in 1921 might have made it to Bulgakov's desk, and thus it was suggested might have inspired him to write his famous sci-fi satire novella Роковые яйца, The Fatal Eggs, in 1926. However, Михайлик, as a scholar, comes to the conclusion that the direct influence is not likely. And this failure to establish historical connection pushes her to write her own version of Bulgakov's novella for a different historical circumstance. It's also her version and obviously an homage to Bulgakov. Mihailik, the scholar, concludes that Bulgakov could not have known about the Crimean sighting of a monster, that it was only coincidence. Mihailik, the poet, uses the newspaper clipping for her own historical fantasy of what might have been if a detachment of Red Army would be stuck in Crimea, dividing its time between following the elusive monster and discussing the situation with Max Voloshin with tea and jam. And also Mihailik finds out that actually it was from the moment of publication of The Fatal Eggs that Voloshin began paying attention to Bulgakov. So there are many intricate details to this literary sujet. While Bulgakov's text of 1926, as most sci-fi texts, hints at very specific social realia of the NEP, Mihailik literally rewrites history here. Her monster belongs now to the realm of the Soviet Civil War that ended in Crimea in 1921, with all its tragedies, anxieties, and historical dead ends. One can say that Mihailik acts here in accordance with dictum with one of the most unforgettable historians of literature of our century, Yuri Tanyanov, who importantly transgressed the boundary between literature and history scholarship and literature making, and who also said, allegedly, я начинаю там, где кончаются факты. I begin my work when I have no facts anymore. Having observed in observation, in fascination and curiosity, all these ideas, motives, creative irregularities, I've decided for the ending of my talk today to do something highly irregular for this format. To ask myself what writing poetry about history allows me to do that I cannot do in my research. So I'll perform one last case study of my own text. And the text is O.B. Голос, coming from a cycle «Справочник ленинградских писателей» 1941-1944. Ангел, но не голубой, алый, алый. Комсомолка Лили Марлен с пуритански закушенной нижней губой, с небывалой плотской ясностью скул. Во всем тебе удача. Только разве вот не задача? НКВДшник выбивает из-под тебя стул, жирная лужа. НКВДшник выбивает из тебя дитя. Но и от этого тремоло энтузиазма практически не убывает. 15 января. Жирный ледяной туман. Стужа. Ты оставляешь в больнице юного нежеланного мужа умирать и запыхаясь, пыхтя, тащишься на улицу Ракова, мимо янтарных трупов и бирюзовых трупов. Ах, какой художник все это рисовал! Твой новейший миллионочек допрашает, где ты была? Что бы об этом сказал Барков? Что бы на это ответил Зубов? Ну что ты такая? Ну что это на тебе? Какой бессмысленный машер, искусительный карнавал. Выпуская ледяное яркое жало, ты лобызаешь его, ты погружаешься в микрофон, отстраняя сомнения. Не слишком ли быстро сюда бежала, покуда там покуда там до ходил он? Нормально. Не слишком быстро. Твой высоконький голос проникает туда, куда другое ничто. Сестры, братья мои, дочки, матери, я восхищаюсь вами, насыщаюсь вами, утешаюсь вами, падая, 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 беспокоясь. Что это на тебе? Пальто Молчанова. А что у нас под пальто? So, in my reading of this text as an interpreter, I am influenced by interpretations suggested by Stephanie Sandler and Valery Shubinsky, but also I'm happy to share story of its creation as known to me. The cycle was conceived, moreover, as a provocation, a critical commentary on my own and largely ours communal lack of knowledge of what happened during the siege of Leningrad, including the city's cultural situation. 5 poems of the cycle depict individual stories of the poets' creative lives during the siege, both the poets of official fame, like Olga Bergoltz, Всеволод Вишневский, Vera Inber, or of no fame at all, like Natalia Krandievskaya. The title of the whole cycle comes from a specific situation. After having worked for months in Dzgali and Publichna Biblioteka of Petersburg, I found all kinds of materials about and texts by the poets of whom I've never heard before. And I decided somehow, again, as a trained philologist, that I need some kind of spravочник. I understood that I was craving spravочник. So in that very Publichka, in the public library of Saltykova-Shchedrina, I was able to locate this kind of encyclopedia called Справочник ленинградских писателей, where I understood that basically none of the poets whose materials I found in the archive were represented there. And it is this absence, this lacuna, that kind of propelled me, I think, to begin working on this text. One of the most important defining gestures is the title of each poem of a cycle. When I decided to use initials instead of the full name of the poet, adding the essential feature, as I understand it, of her presence in the besieged city. So for OB poem, it's Golos. As I fully found out during reading of this cycle in public, especially in Petersburg today, this operation of hiding the name produced a curious result of confused non-recognition, non-full recognition. The main immediate response from the audience became, who are these people? And if in case of Bergoltz, the answer was somewhat obvious, in cases of Krandievskaya, Matyushina, and many others, the non-knowledge persisted. And this is precisely what I wanted to highlight, to expose in this work. The extent to which the siege and its poets and its victims became silenced, erased by the Soviet history, and us as its users, history and historiography, right? Even in case of Bergoltz, perhaps the most famous figure, central figure of the official Soviet siege discourse, we have a situation of double narrative existence. Bergoltz, the muse of the Leningrad radio. I worked in the archive of Leningradsky Radio Komitet, and one of the most striking discoveries there, they have lots of materials, texts of meant for broadcasting, which obviously before going for the broadcast, they were censored. They went to Gorlit. So texts by Bergoltz are marked with green and blue, while many other texts that I've seen, including those by Lydia Ginsburg, Kaverin, and Schwartz, are marked in red. So Bergoltz's situation was in a colorful and colored way, different. And though we have this official situation, of course, as we know now, there was a different layer. It was her diary that I just saw it yesterday. Is now this volume is coming to publication, the third volume, where Bergholz presents very different version of the siege events than her poetry, her propaganda poetry. I was able, again, because of my work in the archive, to read this diary before. And this poem, as all the other other 4 poems of the cycle, are infiltrated, if this is the word, filled with quotes from the author's diaries. I chose authors whose diaries we have. So basically all 5 poems have syntonic nature. So kind of to add my experience, my opinion, to the opinions and experiences of other poets in this Vyborka, writing this kind of poetry allows me, and hopefully my reader, listener, experience emotion about the official propaganda treatment of history. It allows me to pose my question or questions, alerting the readership to lacuna in our communal knowledge. So I guess this is my formulation. Coming from nourished by archival research, poetry becomes an instrument of question making, an agent provocateur for the next necessary rounds of exploration. Thank you. Спасибо.
Thank you, Paulina. This was a really inspiring lecture, and I've learned very much and got many ideas and impulses. But now I would like to open the discussion and invite first our audience to ask questions to you, Paulina, or give comments and hints, and later I will ask also my own question. Perhaps who would like to start? Who will be the first with a question? Luba.
Yes, thank you very much, Paulina. My question is about what poetry gives us. Of course, it gives us an opportunity to ask different questions and have emotional connections. Right? I mean, on some level, this is a powerful answer, right? And on some level, it's maybe an obvious answer. So I wonder if there's something that you feel that your examples maybe exclude your own, because it's kind of an incredible circular moment, which I enjoyed very much, but you could also include your own. What do these examples not give us that poetry, that historical poetry does or has done, right? Are there other ways, aside from filling the lacunae, contextualizing differently, right? Is there something that you haven't included in this talk that if you didn't have to give a talk, right, where a certain narrative gets constructed, that you would have included?
It's an extremely challenging, though useful question, right? What haven't I included that I would like to? Okay, I have one obvious answer. Because I was asked for the purposes of this very presentation to work via English. There is one poet that absolutely fascinates me. And there I have such a problem of translation that I decided maybe not to bring him here, though actually I'm trying to bring him in many conversations. That is Igor Bulatovsky. And one poem, and I would be happy to send it to this forum, that I considered working on, is dedicated to Vertinsky and Lещенко, Piotr Lещенko. And his poem is immensely in various complicated ways. It's for obvious reasons and meta reasons, it works around the notion of sound. Not only everything basically rhymes, all kinds of sound echoes are created in his text, but this subtle sound orchestration, I think, serves to highlight the historical content that, again, in case of Lещенко, by the way, going back to Khersonsky's text, it's about Romania and Odessa and the situation of occupation and collaboration. So on some way, what I think poetry can do in this case is to use its apparatus in terms of, in this case, sound alertness, is to, again, open the reader, if you wish, provoke the reader, turn the reader, yes, in emotional, which I think is, I do find it an emotional instrument, and sensory way to some hidden areas of our conversation about Soviet history. And it's interesting that in this conversation, all the examples are about Soviet history. This is what I'm looking at, though I think it's also an interesting question, what kinds of rereadings, revisions now are being made in regards to the earlier periods. So this is one answer, that poetry can alert our sensory perception to the extent that we begin sensing history somewhat differently. Bulatovsky's poem is organized as, you know, a song that sounds on the old and damaged record. But it is kind of funny to talk about things that are not included. Another example that is not included, and I think I repeated many times, Russophone, Russophone. This is the language I know, this is the language I work with. But in the area of my attention today, there are other Slavic languages, for example, Ukrainian. And there is a project that at the moment attracts all kinds of attention by Mariana Kianovska, Babin Yar Голосами, where she describes the events of 1941 in Kyiv using imaginary perspectives of hundreds and hundreds of participants, victims, perpetrators. So this is a project that we are discussing, translating, criticizing at the moment, and which is situated in a very interesting relationship to the Western, I would say, American academe take on the possibilities and impossibilities and limitations of cultural appropriation and historical appropriation. So what writing history in poetry allows Kinovska, right, is this absolutely daring, again, using this term, step to metamorphose herself into the imaginary voices of the dead and the murderers, and to bring this situation to us, to the year, when was it, a couple of years ago, the book came out. I've been translating ever since, so I can check on the exact date, but she worked on it for a long, long time. So I can hardly imagine kind of historical inquiry, scholarly inquiry today that would allow such a gesture that Kinovskaya works on. Also rather problematic gesture, right? So this is another version. And I am sure that in our conversation, I can think of many interesting other ones. Also, I guess it's not so obvious with the examples that were presented today. So Khersonsky, Kukulin, Mikhailik, Barskova, all of them presenting what I would call красивая поэзия, right? Though there exist all kinds of attempts and projects that present language in its broken state, showing us that the Soviet history was history that broke language in various ways. And this is also an important direction of conversation. So these are some attempts of answer, Luba.
Luba, do you want to answer?
No, this is just saying that.
No, I just want to thank Polina. This was great. Thank you. I like the красивый and уродливый, for example, and others. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Polina. There's another question from David Hock.
Actually, my question was answered, so I have to lower my hand. Thank you.
Okay, is there another question? Maybe I would ask you some questions, Paulina.
Matthias?
Matthias? Okay, then Matthias first, please. I could not see you.
Well, thank you very much for your wonderful and fascinating presentation. It's always marvelous if poets are resurrected from the dead, as it seems, because they come back into our memory. I have a question that is slightly off the mark. I have this wonderful book here by Tchaikovsky, Eta byla v Leningrade. Es war in Leningrad. Now, this was published first in Russian in 1943, and it was published shortly after the end of the Second World War in German. And it is fairly liberal. It is quite surprising how the siege of Leningrad is depicted in that novel. And it coincides with a similar, not really explored period in German literature between 1945 and 1947. So what about this period in Russian literature? Has it been discovered? Because I suppose it must have been a very liberal era and many texts must have been suppressed later on.
Oh, Matthias, wonderful to make this connection. Wonderful to meet you. I love your question. Yes, indeed. When we study literary representations of the siege, we have basically to talk, if not month by month, then year by year. And sometimes we see things that now, retrospectively speaking, we find really kind of surprising, to put it mildly. right? One of the answers is that official literature, publishable using Ginsburg's forever useful term, was constantly in conversation with the urgent needs of propaganda. So when propaganda, for example, wanted hatred and revenge as the main emotions, we find materials of certain kind. And then after Stalingrad battle, after 1943, as we know, intonation changes radically, tenor changes radically. Sometimes in these pockets, we find texts that would be impossible for publication a couple of months later. And this is why I think this is so interesting. So a couple of things, this is a long conversation. I would be happy to have it in a different format or in a format of a conference. You know, it's a big question. But of course, in terms of the siege, everything becomes connected to the situation of Leningradskaya Delo, right? Starting from roughly 1946 till death of Stalin, nothing can be said, nothing can be published. And everything that is published endangers potentially the author. For example, and this is an adjacent conversation, but we all know that the main protagonists of Zhdanovskaya Постановление were Akhmetov and Zaychenko, using Akhmatova's joke, Akhmatova and Zощенко, for all kinds of almost mysterious reasons why they were chosen. They were chosen because they were famous. The fact that none of them were in Leningrad during the siege is, of course, kind of curious. But Постановление was much longer than what we kind of remember on our daily basis. There were other victims, and one of them was Gennady Gor, one of the main voices of the siege literature as we think now. So his whole career was very much touched by Leningradskaya Delo. So Leningradskaya Delo, I see it as some kind of воронка, which defines these things. Another thing that I want to bring to your attention is that in the early 60s, and it is Ilya Kukulin who brought my attention to this when we worked on some questions, we see publications of the siege material that, again, to our understanding today, like they're really surprising. Notes of Leonid Panteleev were published, who is the creatura of the first poem in this cycle of mine about the siege writers, where he openly mentions, describes, pronounces death of Harms. And again, when we think about how Soviet literature operated, it's surprising. Death of Daniel Harms was perhaps, if we bring hierarchy to deaths, which is not necessary, is the main literary siege death. So again, it's so interesting to understand in which pockets things were possible and which pockets things were impossible for publication. Thank you for your question, Matthias. I will shut up.
Thank you for your talk.
Next question, David.
Hi, Polina. Thank you so much.